Welcome, listeners, to the Religious Studies Project. Again, it's Monday morning, and that means that you're joined by me, David Robertson.
And me, Christopher Cotter. We're going back in time a little bit, and we're recording in a pub. It's been a while since we've done that, David. Why are we doing that?
We are doing that because we're on strike.
Well, I'm technically not on strike, but I support the strike.
And I am on strike. Therefore, I don't want to go into the university where we usually record. Now, of course, we're not on strike from producing the Religious Studies Project because that's supported by the listeners.
Exactly. But yes, fingers crossed that by the time this goes out, the Universities and Colleges Union and Universities UK will have come to some sort of amicable, awesome arrangement.
Yes.
But this does mean that for the next 3 weeks, we're going to be recording in the Wash Bar in Edinburgh.
Indeed.
It's also, last week was Pie Week.
It was International Pie Week. I think it's a pie in the American sense, you know, the fruit pies rather than savoury pies.
Exactly, but in commemoration of that, we've got a special interview for you with Michael Pye, spelled P-Y-E, on, P-Y-E, sorry, I put the emphasis in the wrong place there, on religious change in Japanese Shinto, conducted by Hans van Eygen at the most recent EASR conference. And we're just going to pass straight over to Michael and Hans.
Okay, I'm with Professor Michael Pye at University of Marburg to discuss Shintoism. Welcome, Professor Michael Pye.
Thank you.
First question. Shinto is often called the native religion of Japan. Could you tell us a little bit about that definition, what might be wrong with it?
Yes. Well, it is a native religion of Japan. That's not problematic in itself, I think. But the problem is that during the long history of Japan, what we now call Shinto was constantly created and recreated. So what people nowadays regard as Shinto isn't necessarily what was Shinto a few hundred years ago or 1,000 years ago, etc. That's the problem.
And what would be some of the main differences between current Shintoism and, say, ancient Shintoism?
Well, excuse me. I think the main point is that in the 19th century, Shinto became ideologized and used by the state in support of nationalism. And so, therefore, new agendas appeared, which were of a modern kind. And prior to that, there was a long period when Shinto was very closely identified with Buddhism. It was difficult to separate them out. They formed part of a wide religious complex. And then, if we look back even earlier, we have difficulty in being sure that Shinto was very much like what modern Shinto is like. Nevertheless, there are ancient traditions of the worship of kami and rituals connected with kami. That's the divinities in Shinto. And so there are important continuities. But as I said, because of the long history, there have been many shifts and developments.
Well, some, mainly Japanese scholars, I've been told, try to argue that there's a form of pure Shintoism that goes all the way back to ancient times, which got corrupted during the Middle Ages. Could you tell us a little bit something about their claim and what's maybe wrong with it?
Well, I think that what's wrong with it is that they're trying to posit a unique pure Shinto, which can't really be historically maintained. And they want to do that. Well, they want to do that because they want it to be. They want it to be the national religion of the whole of the Japanese people. Not all Japanese people agree with that and want that, but they would like it to be that. So therefore, they are laying claim to the origins of the Japanese people and the origins of the imperial line of emperors. In an attempt to have a kind of coherent civic religion, which is it just doesn't fit with what we know about the ancient periods.
Mm-hmm. And how doesn't it fit? Like,
well, it doesn't fit because although some kami rites, Shinto rites, were organized by the court, the ancient court, the Yamato court, we don't actually know very much about what happened in the regions of Japan, what kind of religious practices there were, and these were not really coordinated in something which we can call Shinto.
Okay. And the whole influence of Buddhism, like their claim of the Japanese scholars suggests that there was a process when they tried to do away with Buddhist influences.
Yeah,
was that
did.
actually the case? Yeah.
Yes, in the 19th century they definitely tried to separate Buddhism and Shinto. It's called Shinbutsu Bunri, separating the Shinto, the Shin of Shinto means kami, and the Butsu, the Buddhas of Buddhism. So they effectively took away Buddhist images and Buddhist practices away from the shrines and tried to create and promote a pure Shinto as they thought of it.
And who did this? The government, I assume.
The government led it, and then it was done. The government wished it and decreed it, but it was carried out, of course, by shrine authorities.
And how did the people respond? Like, often the people are very resistant to religious changes. They try to keep doing the practices they always did. Was there something like that going on, or did they just follow the dictates?
Well, there wasn't very much resistance because it wasn't very easy to resist it, actually. And to some extent, after the Second World War, there has been a move to return to a closer symbiosis of Buddhism and Shinto, but at the time it wasn't really possible to resist it.
Mm-hmm.
So part of that movement also was to install the divinities which are mentioned in the ancient texts in shrines all over Japan, where previously there had been more mysterious divinities of maybe an ambiguous nature. So they tried to clean up the kind of character of Shinto in many ways, not only by removing Buddhist influences, but also by organizing the pantheon the Shinto pantheon in a sort of structured way.
Well, the whole symbiosis with Buddhism, I imagine Buddhism has a very specific goal in mind with what Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and spirits are doing for people, what role they play. So could you tell us a little bit about that, how that changed Shintoism?
Well, I think you may be thinking of the situation in which Buddhist leaders, Buddhist monks and thinkers tried to assimilate Shinto divinities and mobilize them for the purposes of leading people into Buddhism.
Indeed.
Is that what you're thinking about?
Or leading them into salvation.
Yes, leading them into salvation, or enlightenment rather, leading them into the path of Buddhahood. Butsudo is the path of Buddhahood. I think Mahayana Buddhism is quite well known for its tolerant, integrative attitude towards the great variety of religious practices. It's not so much tolerance in a kind of modern Western liberal sense, but more in the sense of making room for things to be carried out, popular practices, daily practices, in which people have the possibility of satisfying their daily needs, their practical needs, for security, safety, for good harvests, for benefits of various kinds in this world. And so Mahayana Buddhism, which is most Japanese forms of Buddhism are in the Mahayana tradition, Mahayana Buddhism seeks to make room for all of these things in order to lead people towards Buddhist ideas. So it has a sort of, the leading monks have a very reflective attitude about that. They understand those processes.
It sounds rather like Buddhism is incorporating Shintoism into a broader framework, rather than there is a symbiosis where the two are mutual partners.
Well, no, they weren't. In the heyday of the medieval period, they were not really mutual partners, that's true. But Buddhism, especially esoteric Buddhism, was the dominant partner. Okay. And so that's why when you have the more decisive response by Shinto thinkers, Shinto-oriented thinkers, and especially when it came to be backed up by the government, the attempt was made to take the initiative over against Buddhism.
I want to get back to post-war Shintoism.
Okay.
You said we again see a symbiosis with Buddhism or mutual influences. Like, I imagine, like, some Shinto thinkers aren't happy with that. Are there people who try to do away with that or try to respond to that, or isn't that really a thing?
Well, I don't think so. This is not a massive movement, but we've recently seen some signs. For example, the head temple of Tendai Buddhism on Mount Hiei near Kyoto has been making overtures to the priests in charge of the Ise shrine, which is closely linked with the imperial family, where the sun goddess is enshrined, Amaterasu, or Mikami. And so these overtures are a kind of friendly approach, which is quite supportive of Shinto institutions and Tendai Buddhist institutions. Not all Buddhists are interested in that, but there isn't really any complaint. There isn't really any resistance to that on the part of Shinto leaders, because they're happy to be recognized, to find wider recognition in Japanese society.
Okay. And I want to touch on another point now. Again, on post-war Shintoism. There's the experience of the war, of course.
Yeah.
It must have been traumatic. How did that influence Shintoism? It was, of course, the emperor renouncing his powers, more or less. What was the impact of the war, and especially the after-war period, on Shintoism?
Well, it's a big subject. But by the way, we usually speak of Shinto rather than Shintoism.
I'm sorry.
It's okay, but Shintoism is widely used. I know the word is used, but it rather suggests an ideology rather than a religion. So I prefer to speak of Shinto usually. The first main point is that the official forms of Shinto were disestablished, separated from the state. That was a very necessary move after the end of the war. And so there is a problem about the ways in which contemporary Shinto can be part of public life. There are various problems about that. For example, we have the problem about Yasukuni Shrine, which is where the Japanese war dead are enshrined. And whether the Prime Minister of Japan can go to visit that shrine as Prime Minister. And of course, in recent years, they have been doing that. So other people have objected to that. So
because they're war criminals.
Well, that's one reason. But yes, because a small number of war criminals convicted war criminals are enshrined there. But the main problem is the question of the separation of religion and state. You see, so people don't really want to have a blurring of that distinction, which is an important guarantee for the secular democracy which we now have in Japan. So that's one of the problems. And a similar problem arose with the enthronement of the present emperor, because the emperor is descended from the previous emperors, of course, and the enthronement is partly based on religious traditions connected with Amaterasu, the sun goddess. And so how can you have the enthronement of the emperor in a non-religious way? That was the problem. So, in fact, they did it quite well because they had two separate lots of activity. One was the public secular ascension of the throne and a declaration by the emperor himself. And the other part was a series of rituals in the imperial household, in the gardens, in the grounds of the imperial palace in Tokyo. So those two things were separated. And I thought that was quite successful. But some of the other things are not so successful. So with Yasukuni Shrine, there is blurring of the distinctions, and in some other cases too.
Sorry to interrupt the episode, but we just wanted to let you know, to remind you about our Patreon link. The Religious Studies Project has always been free since its inception, but we know that there's a great problem in academia with people not being paid for the work that they're expected to do, particularly early career scholars. And we at the RSP want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So you can help if you can spare even £1 a month by going to patreon.com/projectrs and subscribing. We know that these podcasts are very useful for people who are teaching and people in their learning. So if you can help either by subscribing there or by making a one-off donation using the PayPal button on our website, it would be greatly appreciated and will help us keep bringing you this podcast for free and fight against exploitation in academia. But now, back to the episode.
What's the main motivation for separating Shinto and a public life of public officials? Is it just that separation of church and state as we have here? Or is there more going on? Are they afraid of what happened in the past that will repeat itself?
It was actually forced upon the Japanese government immediately after the war by the American occupation.
Would you elaborate on that?
There was a directive given that this should all be separated out. And so that was combined with the freedom of religions law, which made it possible for other religions in Japan to organize very well, including a good number of new religions, some of which had been oppressed in the meantime, and some of which were newly founded after the war. So religious freedom is an aspect of it. So if you're going to have religious freedom, I'll say that again. If you're going to have religious freedom, you can't at the same time have a state religion which is completely dominant and not permitting space for other religions to organize. And this is a classic problem all over the world.
There's no idea that the past connection of Shinto and the imperial family is led to do atrocious things. It has nothing to do with it.
Well, there is among the Japanese population, but within the world of Shinto shrines, this is not something which is talked about very much.
Okay.
But in some other important religious denominations, such as Shin Buddhism, and also in Soto Zen Buddhism, there is a very clear understanding that Shinto led, that organized, modern, politicized Shinto contributed to leading Japan into war and disaster.
Mm-hmm.
So remember that the population of Japan is very large, well over 100 million. I don't know what it is just today, but 120 or something. So there is quite a lot of room for people to have different views.
And connected to that nowadays, some claim we see some resurgence of Japanese nationalism. Is there some implications for current Shinto, or is it isn't an issue?
Well, there's a constant resurgence of Japanese nationalism, in my opinion.
Is there?
Yes, ever since the Second World War, there have been. We've had mainly right-of-centre governments in Japan. And usually some members of the government have been saying things which are quite right-wing and even militaristic. But of course the constitution doesn't permit Japan to have an army in the same sense as some other countries, although they have very large self-defense forces. But anyway, the public figures sometimes say quite disturbing things about the past of Japan and the and how it wasn't so bad, and this, that, and the other. You see, so whereas on the other hand, there are those who resist this. There are quite a lot of people who want to defend Clause 9 of the Constitution, which forbids having a military.
But those that say
Pardon?
these things about the past, they don't make a connection to Shinto, or they don't identify
Well,
Shinto
the ones
more
who
strongly.
the ones who criticize it identify Shinto with that, and they identify the emperor system with that. But within the Shinto world, there is not really very much concern about that. They rather tend to be on the right wing, tolerating right wing attitudes.
Okay.
I think we say, speaking very generally, that's the way. So, but of course, the Shinto world is quite large. There are many shrines. There are many priests who have been educated in various universities, and I think it's of interest to speak above all with moderate Shinto figures, and to encourage them, encourage moderate Shinto thinkers or leaders to keep a steady view and not to rush off into some right-wing movements or something like that.
You talk about moderate Shinto. Does that
Yeah.
imply that there is a not moderate Shinto as well?
Oh yes. So I mean, well, some of the leaders of Shinto shrines are not actually very reflective about politics, so they obviously have an uncritical view about Japan's past, and there is always a danger that they will encourage nationalism. I mean, especially if they're talking about Shinto as the religion of the ethnic group, so this tends to focus on the particular ethnic group, and that's the seedbed of nationalism. But some of the Shinto leaders are more widely educated, and it's easier to talk with them and help them to have a balanced view of their own history.
But in your opinion, the non-moderates aren't gaining ground or aren't gaining influence?
I don't think so, not particularly, no. Things are fairly stable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, as far as I know.
And is there a connection between these less or non-moderate people and those who advocate like the view of a pure Shinto in the ancient time? Are there people like that? Who
Yes, they are more likely to be saying that, yes. I've advanced the notion that Shinto, this is my personal way of looking at it, that Shinto, in inverted commas, is an adapted religion, and it's an adapted primal religion. In other words, it does have indigenous roots.
In Japan?
In Japan, yes, indigenous in Japan. It's not an imported religion. It has indigenous roots in Japan, so that's what I call a primal religion. Some people just call it an indigenous religion. I call it primal religion. And this has been adapted due to the changing political and social circumstances up until the present day, when it's quite complicated. And the moderate Shinto leaders are quite happy with that understanding. And they are less likely to be asserting some kind of simplified, essential Shinto as having been there from time immemorial. So they are quite happy to perceive the historical vicissitudes and changes, and they know perfectly well that the way in which Shinto was used politically in the 19th and early 20th century is not really a possible way for Japan in the future. So they are providing a more balanced service to religious needs of Japanese people without having a heavy politicized attitude.
And like apart from the shrines and the priests, like the common people, the common practitioners, is that something that's on their mind? Whether there's a pure Shinto?
No, I don't think so. They just go to the shrine to get their fortunes told and to pray for benefits and for a quiet life and prosperity and so on. People are not really thinking about this. No, I don't think so.
And do they show certain more symbiosis with Buddhism, as you see here in the West? Christians who meditate, Christians who attend other services even. You see that in Japan as well? With Shinto practitioners who are engaged in Buddhist practices or other practices?
Well,
themselves?
Some Buddhist denominations are quite tolerant of Shinto practices. but others are more strict, and they don't really want their believers, their followers, to take part in the practices of Shinto shrines. But as far as the Shinto shrine leaders are concerned, they don't really mind if people go to Buddhist temples or not. They just like them to come to the shrine first. For example, at New Year, please come to the shrine first, the local shrine, and then you can go off somewhere else to celebrate New Year in a different way. That's quite common.
There's no friction in certain Shinto beliefs and certain Buddhist beliefs, for example? Or?
Well, there is between... in general, there is not, in the minds of maybe the majority of people, but there is some friction in the case of the more, what we might call the more decisive popular denominations of Buddhism. Shin Buddhism, which has about 16 million followers after all, and also Nichiren Buddhism, and some of the new Buddhist movements, which have a rather strict view of their own form of Buddhism. And so there is, to some extent, a rejection of Shinto. They try to encourage people not to bother with Shinto practices, not to bother to go to Shinto shrines, but to concentrate on their own religious practice. And of course, because there is no public religious education in schools, because of the separation of religion and state, people in general are not very well informed about the variety of religions in Japan. They don't actually know very much about the different Buddhist denominations, or if they're in Buddhist context, they don't know very much about Shinto shrines, for example. So that's part of it. Some ignorance, difference through ignorance, you might say.
Okay. And a final question about the study of Shinto. Like these questions about pure Shinto and symbiosis with Buddhism. How do you see it going forward? Is there building a consensus somehow that the ancient pure Shinto isn't a worldwide approach? Or is it...
Do you mean among scholars or
yes,
among
among
Shinto?
scholars.
Among scholars. Well, I think that's pretty well accepted among scholars that there wasn't an original pure Shinto which we could just define and grasp. But that the origins are complex, and that the focusing of something which we can call Shinto actually took place step by step, and later than the oldest documents that we have. So I think that's everybody realizes that. But the problem arises because when Japanese writers, maybe rather popular writers and media people, when they refer to Shinto as if it were an original pure thing which you can just get from the past. That's the problem, but not among academics.
And that isn't going away?
No, that won't go away. I don't think so.
I'm not very optimistic.
No, because it's an ideological statement which people find easy to swallow. So they will keep on saying that for some time. We just have to learn to live with that and to maintain the academic clarity over against the religious standpoints. But you find this in any studies of religion. You have to distinguish between the academic reflection on it and the historical analysis on the one hand, and the religious positions on the other hand, which are quite often misleading or incorrect.
Thank you very much for this very interesting interview.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for that, Michael and Hans. Always a pleasure to hear from both of them. Talking of pies, I mean, there was a hint of sweetness there, but definitely lots to get your teeth into.
Absolutely.
And to chew over. But also great to have, more on Asia, Japan in particular, part of the world that we're very curious about, but don't get enough of.
It's fantastic to have a luminary in both BASR and IEHR history as part of the RSP. So thanks so much to Professor Pye. What else have we got to say? The website's been playing up a little bit lately, listeners, and we're sorry about that. We've been trying to extricate our website from the current hosting providers, and we're just going to name and shame them. DigitalOcean, never work with them.
No, don't.
Never. Don't do it. You'd be surprised how difficult they've been making our life and how difficult it is to get your website off them.
Not only refusing to help, but then preventing us from doing something about it ourselves. That's not good. And at the same time complaining that we're not, oh, you haven't paid us enough for this month.
Yeah.
But the website must be up and running if you're listening to this.
Exactly.
But don't forget that if the site is down, and it's always going to happen from time to time, all of our most recent interviews are all available still on YouTube. Some of them in video format as well, so you can check them out over there. And we are working on a long-term plan to get this sorted, and we'll be on a nice shiny new host soon as.
Very near future. So next week we've got a quite recent interview that David recorded when he was down at the Open University conference just towards the end of February there, and this is on magic and modernity with Richard Irvine and Theodoros Kyriakides. Is that correct?
Kyriakides. And this was they're doing a research project there, which is actually part of the what's the religion, the non-religion big project?
Yeah, the Understanding Unbelief.
Unbelief one that Lois Lee's involved with, but instead of focusing on the non-religion aspect of it, because we had Chris's interview with Lois very recently, and we decided to think more about the magical thinking aspects of it. So basically, they are looking at these kind of interactions with objects and magical thinking, but doing a comparative project in Orkney and in Cyprus. So it's two very different kind of areas. And it's a really fascinating conversation. And we don't go too far into the specifics of their project either, so we hope to have them back towards the end of the project.
Fantastic. I'm really looking forward to that. So listeners, you can come back next week, and fingers crossed we will be here, and we'll still be in the Wash Bar in Edinburgh. But from David and I...
Thanks for listening.
The Religious Studies Project is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions. The RSP is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, SCIO, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation, charity number SCO 47750.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson, and our managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Jonathan Tuckett, and our Opportunities Digest by Ella Bock. Podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, with audio editing by Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford, and sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop.
Don't forget you can support the project by using our amazon.com.co.uk and .ca links, or donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes and other portals.